There's a story you were taught in school, a story so clean, so elegant, so perfectly wrapped up that it became more than science. It became identity. It became origin myth for the modern age. The story goes like this. About 200,000 years ago, somewhere in East Africa, probably in what is now Ethiopia or Kenya, the first true humans appeared. Homo sapiens, us, anatomically modern, behaviourally sophisticated. Everything that came before was prologue. Everything that came after was conquest. These first humans, the story continues, stayed in Africa for over 100,000 years, slowly developing, perfecting their stone tools, learning to control fire, creating the first art, the first symbols, the first stirrings of what we'd recognise as culture. Then, around 70,000 years ago, maybe 60,000, a small group of them walked out of Africa, maybe a few hundred individuals, maybe a few thousand. They crossed into the Middle East, then spread across Asia into Europe, eventually reaching Australia and the Americas. Everywhere they went, they replaced whoever was already there. Neanderthals in Europe, Homo erectus in Asia, all the archaic humans who'd been living on those continents for hundreds of thousands of years. Gone, replaced, driven extinct by the superiority of the new African arrivals. It's called the out of Africa theory, or the recent African origin model, or the replacement hypothesis. Different names, same core idea, one origin, one migration, one story to explain all of humanity. And for decades, this wasn't just the leading theory. It was treated as established fact. The debate was over. Science had spoken. We all came from Africa, and that was that. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing the comments. Someone in Melbourne at dawn, Tokyo at midnight, someone in Ohio at 3 in the morning. All of us wondering about the same thing. Where did we actually come from? Here's why this story became so powerful. It wasn't just about bones and DNA. It was about us, about human unity. The Out of Africa theory said that all humans alive today, all 8 billion of us, share a recent common ancestry. We're all Africans, just some of us left more recently than others. Skin colour, eye shape, all the physical differences between populations, they're superficial. Recent adaptations to different environments. Beneath them, we're essentially identical because we all descend from the same small African population that existed just a geological eye blink ago. This had profound implications. It meant race, in the biological sense, didn't exist, couldn't exist. There hadn't been enough time or enough separation for human populations to diverge into subspecies. We were one species, one family, with one shared African home. In the aftermath of centuries of scientific racism, of skull measurements used to justify slavery and genocide, of evolutionary theories twisted to support white supremacy, the Out of Africa model offered something redemptive, a scientifically rigorous origin story that emphasized unity over division, recent shared ancestry over ancient separations. Charles Darwin saw it coming. Back in 1871, in The Descent of Man, he predicted that human origins would be found in Africa. His reasoning was simple. Our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, live in Africa. Therefore, our common ancestor probably lived there too. For over a century, this was just speculation. Provocative, plausible, but unproven. The fossil evidence, sparse as it was, came from all over. Neanderthals in Europe, Java man in Indonesia, Peking man in China. If anything, the early fossil record suggested multiple centres of human evolution scattered across the old world. Then, in 1987, everything changed. A team of geneticists led by Alan Wilson, Rebecca Cann, and Mark Stoneking published a paper that would revolutionise our understanding of human origins. They'd analysed mitochondrial DNA from 147 people from around the world. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through mothers, mutates at a relatively predictable rate, like a molecular clock ticking away the generations. When they traced all these maternal lineages back, they found something remarkable. They all converged on a single woman who lived in Africa between 140,000 and 290,000 years ago. The media dubbed her Mitochondrial Eve. The name stuck, even though it was misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at her time. She wasn't even necessarily special. She was just the woman whose mitochondrial lineage happened to survive to the present day, while everyone else's daughters' eventually had sons instead of daughters, breaking the maternal chain. But the name didn't matter. What mattered was the implication. All modern humans, the entire species, traced back to a recent African ancestor. This genetic evidence hit the scientific community like a thunderbolt. Before this, the dominant theory had been multi-regional evolution, the idea that modern humans evolved simultaneously in different parts of the world, from local populations of Homo erectus that had left Africa over 1 million years ago. Gene flow between these regions kept them part of the same species, but different populations contributed to modern humans in different places. Europeans descended primarily from Neanderthals, Asians from Asian Homo erectus, Africans from African ancestors. The mitochondrial DNA evidence seemed to demolish this. If everyone's maternal lineage went back to Africa, to a woman who lived less than 300,000 years ago, then there couldn't have been separate regional evolution. The African population must have expanded out of the continent and replaced everyone else. Complete replacement. No mixing. No contribution from the local archaic populations. A clean sweep. More evidence piled up. Y chromosome studies, looking at paternal lineages, found the same pattern. The most ancient, most diverse Y chromosome lineages existed in Africa. Outside Africa, the diversity dropped dramatically, exactly what you'd expect if a small population had left Africa recently and then expanded. Skull measurements showed the same thing. Genetic diversity in living populations showed the same thing. The farther you got from East Africa, the less genetic variation you found. It was like watching ripples spread from a stone dropped in a pond, each ripple carrying less energy than the last. By the early 2000s, the out-of-Africa theory had achieved something rare in science, near universal acceptance. Sure, a few holdouts remained. Milford Wolpoff and his colleagues kept arguing for multi-regional evolution, kept pointing to fossil evidence they claimed showed continuity between ancient and modern populations in different regions. But they were increasingly marginalized. The genetic evidence seemed overwhelming. The fossil record, properly interpreted, supported an African origin. Even new fossil discoveries seemed to fit perfectly into the out-of-Africa framework. In 2003, fossils from Herto in Ethiopia, dated to 160,000 years ago, showed anatomically modern humans already living in Africa at a time when Neanderthals still dominated Europe. In 2005, the Omo remains from Ethiopia were redated to 195,000 years ago, pushing back the oldest known Homo sapiens even further. Every new discovery seemed to confirm the story. Africa was special. Africa was first. Africa was home. The timeline crystallized into textbook certainty. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens evolved in Africa by 200,000 years ago. They stayed there, developing behaviorally modern traits like symbolic thinking, complex language, and sophisticated tool use. Around 70,000 years ago, maybe triggered by a near-extinction event like the eruption of Mount Toba, a small population migrated out of Africa. They spread rapidly along the coast of Asia, reaching Australia by 60,000 years ago. They moved into Europe by 45,000 years ago, where they encountered and replaced the Neanderthals. By 15,000 years ago, they'd reached the Americas. By then, every other human species on Earth was extinct. Homo sapiens stood alone. This is the story that got taught in every anthropology class, repeated in every documentary, printed in every textbook. It became conventional wisdom, common knowledge, the kind of thing everyone educated just knew. Ask anyone on the street where humans came from, and they'd tell you, Africa. Obviously. Didn't everyone know that? But here's the thing about scientific consensus. It's not truth. It's just the best explanation we have for the evidence we've found so far. And sometimes, the evidence changes. Sometimes new discoveries don't fit the comfortable narrative. Sometimes, the more we learn, the less certain we become. Sometimes the story we thought we knew turns out to be nowhere near as simple as we'd believed. The out-of-Africa theory, that elegant, unifying, redemptive origin story, is cracking. Not falling apart entirely, not being completely overturned, but cracking. Developing fissures that can't be ignored. Accumulating contradictions that can't be explained away. And the more we look, the more we sequence ancient DNA, The more fossils we find in unexpected places, the clearer it becomes that human origins were far messier, far more complicated, far more interesting than the clean replacement model ever allowed. What if humans didn't originate in Africa? Or more precisely, what if Homo sapiens didn't originate in one place at all? What if we emerge from multiple populations spread across Africa and beyond? Populations that stayed in contact, that interbred, that contributed to the modern human genome in different ways and different amounts? What if Neanderthals and Denisovans weren't replaced but absorbed? What if there were multiple migrations out of Africa, not just one? What if some of those migrations happened hundreds of thousands of years earlier than the official timeline allows? These aren't fringe questions anymore. These aren't the desperate arguments of holdout multi-regionalists clinging to a dying theory. These are serious scientific questions being asked by mainstream researchers, questions raised by solid evidence that doesn't fit the out-of-Africa model. The consensus is collapsing. Not because the science was wrong, but because the science has gotten better. We know more now, and what we know is complicated. The comfortable certainty of the out-of-Africa theory, the idea that we all came from one place at one time in one migration, it's dissolving. Being replaced by something harder to summarize in a single sentence. Something that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks or documentaries. Something that requires us to hold multiple possibilities in our minds at once. To accept uncertainty, to acknowledge that the origins of our species might be fundamentally more complex than we'd like them to be. This isn't a story about science getting it wrong. This is a story about science doing what it's supposed to do, following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Even when it means admitting that the story we told for decades, the story that made sense of who we are and where we came from, might have been a useful approximation, but not the full truth. So let's follow that evidence. Let's look at the fossils that don't fit, the DNA that tells a different story, the timeline that keeps getting pushed back and complicated. Let's explore what the newest science actually says about human origins. Not what we want it to say, not what the textbooks still claim, but what the evidence, messy and incomplete and constantly changing, actually reveals. Because the truth, it turns out, is a lot stranger than the story they told us, and a lot more interesting. Let's start with Morocco. Not exactly where you'd expect to find the oldest Homo sapiens fossils, right? The standard out-of-Africa story focuses on East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, the Great Rift Valley region where our ancestors supposedly evolved in isolation, developing all the traits that make us human before spreading across the continent and eventually beyond. Morocco is way up in the northwest corner of Africa, thousands of miles from the supposed cradle of humanity. It's the wrong place. Which makes what researchers found there in 2017 so profoundly unsettling for the clean narrative. At a site called Jebel Irhoud, about 50 kilometers southeast of the Moroccan city of Serfi, paleontologists had been finding human fossils since the 1960s. The site was a puzzle from the beginning. The skulls looked weird, not quite Neanderthal, not quite modern human, something in between. They had prominent brow ridges and elongated brain cases, archaic features that didn't fit well with Homo sapiens. But they also had relatively flat faces and other details that seemed surprisingly modern. For decades, nobody knew quite what to make of Jebel Irhoud. The fossils were initially dated to around 40,000 years old, which made them curiosities but not particularly important. Later work in the 1990s pushed the date back to between 100,000 and 200,000 years old. Still, they didn't fit comfortably into any existing framework. They were anomalies, interesting but peripheral to the main story of human evolution happening in East Africa. Then the new dating came in, using improved techniques. A team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology determined that the Jebel Irhoud fossils weren't 100,000 years old. They were 315,000 years old. 315,000. That's not just older than expected. That's more than 100,000 years older than the previous oldest known Homo sapiens fossils. It pushes back the origin of our species by over 100,000 years and moves the location from East Africa to North Africa. Let that sink in for a moment. The oldest definitively Homo sapiens fossils we've found aren't from Ethiopia or Kenya. They're from Morocco, on the opposite side of a continent that's 3,000 miles wide. and they're so old that they predate the supposed East African origin by an enormous margin. This isn't a minor adjustment to the timeline, this is a fundamental challenge to the idea that our species evolved in one place. But it gets stranger. The Jebel-Ir-Hood people had brains that were already essentially modern in size. Their faces were already flat and tucked under the brain case in the way that characterizes modern humans. They were making sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, hunted large game. By most measures, they were us, or at least, they were early members of our lineage, our species in a form so ancient that calling them Homo sapiens strains the definition, but can't be avoided because they're too modern to be anything else. Jean-Jacques Soublin and his colleagues proposed something radical to explain this. They suggested that Homo sapiens didn't evolve in one region and then spread. Instead, they argued, our species emerged from populations distributed across the entire African continent. Different groups in different regions, all evolving modern features at roughly the same time, all staying in genetic contact with each other, all contributing to what would eventually become fully modern Homo sapiens. A Pan-African origin, not an East African one. Evolution on a continental scale. This wasn't what the Out of Africa model predicted. That model assumed a single origin point, a Garden of Eden somewhere in the East African Rift Valley. From there, modern humans spread across Africa first, then out of Africa to the rest of the world. But Jebel-Ir-Hood suggests something more complex. It suggests that by 300,000 years ago, modern humans or their immediate predecessors were already spread across thousands of miles of Africa. From Ethiopia to Morocco, all of them part of the same broad evolutionary transition. The textbooks didn't account for this. The documentaries didn't show this. This was messy. This was complicated. This suggested that looking for the birthplace of Homo sapiens might be like looking for the birthplace of the Atlantic Ocean. It's not a place. It's a process that happened across a vast area. But Morocco wasn't alone. In 2018, another bombshell. This time from Israel, from a cave site called Misliya on the western slopes of Mount Carmel. Researchers had found a jawbone. Just a jaw, but a jaw that told a story the Out of Africa timeline couldn't easily accommodate. The maxilla, as anthropologists call it, held most of its teeth. The team analysed it using micro-CT scans, three-dimensional virtual reconstructions, compared it to every other hominin fossil in the database. The conclusion was clear. This was Homo sapiens, anatomically modern. All the diagnostic features were there. The dating was the problem, or rather, the opportunity, depending on your perspective. The Misliya jaw was between 177,000 and 194,000 years old. This made it the oldest Homo sapiens fossil ever found outside of Africa, by a huge margin. The previous record holders, fossils from the Israeli sites of Skul and Kafze, dated to around 90,000 to 120,000 years ago. Those fossils had always been explained as an early failed migration out of Africa, a pioneering group that didn't survive, didn't contribute to later populations. But Misliya was 70,000 years older than those. Think about what this means. According to the standard Out of Africa model, modern humans weren't supposed to leave Africa until around 70,000 years ago. That was the big migration, the one that led to all non-African populations alive today. There were hints of earlier attempts like the Skul and Kafse people, but those were considered dead ends, evolutionary experiments that didn't work out. But Misliya says modern humans were already in the Middle East, already outside of Africa, nearly 200,000 years ago. Not as a failed expedition, but as an established presence, because they left behind stone tools showing sophisticated hunting techniques and fire control. Rolf Quam from Binghamton University, one of the researchers on the team, called it exciting and unsettling in the same breath. Exciting because it proved humans left Africa much earlier than believed. Unsettling because it meant modern humans were potentially meeting and interacting with archaic human groups, Neanderthals and others, for a much longer period of time than the replacement model allowed. Longer interaction means more opportunities for cultural exchange, more opportunities for genetic exchange, more opportunities for outcomes other than simple replacement. The standard model said modern humans burst out of Africa around 70,000 years ago and rapidly replaced everyone they met. But if modern humans had been trickling out of Africa, living alongside Neanderthals and other archaic humans for over 100,000 years, replacement starts looking less like conquest and more like absorption, less like a single event and more like a long, complex process with multiple migrations, multiple interactions, multiple possible outcomes. And then there's Greece. In 2019, a team led by Katerina Harvati announced they'd reanalyzed a skull fragment from Apidema Cave in southern Greece. The fragment, called Apidema 1, had been sitting in a museum since the 1970s. Everyone assumed it was Neanderthal. It came from Europe. It was old, therefore Neanderthal. But Harvati's team CT scanned it, virtually reconstructed it, compared it to hundreds of other skulls. Their conclusions shocked the field. Apidema 1 wasn't Neanderthal, it was Homo sapiens, and it was 210,000 years old. 210,000 years ago, in Europe, where modern humans weren't supposed to be for another 160,000 years. This wasn't just challenging the timeline, this was obliterating it. If the dating and identification are correct, and many researchers are still skeptical, then modern humans were in Europe at essentially the same time the oldest known Homo sapiens were living in Africa, not spreading out from Africa after evolving there, potentially evolving alongside African populations, or even, the most radical possibility, evolving partly outside Africa. The Apidema skull is controversial. Critics argue that a small skull fragment isn't enough evidence to overturn decades of accumulated knowledge. They point out that Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens skulls can be hard to distinguish from fragmentary remains. They note that the dating, while sophisticated, involves reconstructing the geological history of a disturbed cave site. Maybe the skull isn't as old as claimed. Maybe it's been misidentified. Maybe it's an outlier that doesn't represent a viable population. But here's what the critics can't easily dismiss. Apidema isn't alone anymore. It's part of a pattern. Morocco at 315,000 years. Israel at 177,000 years. Greece potentially at 210,000 years. Each of these finds was initially treated as an anomaly, something that didn't fit the accepted model and therefore must be explained away, reinterpreted, treated with extra skepticism. But at some point when the anomalies pile up, when the evidence that doesn't fit the model keeps accumulating, you have to start wondering whether the model is wrong. The standard out of Africa narrative is simple, it's elegant, it's easy to teach. Humans evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago, stayed there until 70,000 years ago, then spread across the world in a single major migration. But the actual fossil evidence is messier, much messier. We have potentially modern humans or near-modern humans in Morocco over 300,000 years ago. We have them in Israel 200,000 years ago. We have them maybe in Greece 210,000 years ago. We have stone tools in India dated to 74,000 years ago that look African in style, suggesting modern humans were already deep into Asia long before the supposed 70,000 year ago migration. These aren't minor discrepancies. These aren't details that can be smoothed over with slight adjustments to the timeline. These are fundamental challenges to the idea that human origins followed a single, simple path. Out of Africa? Sure, but when? How many times? From where in Africa? And what about all those hundreds of thousands of years when modern or near-modern humans were apparently already spread across multiple continents? What were they doing? Who were they meeting? What happened to them? The clean narrative says the Skul and Kafsa people in Israel, who lived around 100,000 years ago, were a failed outmigration. They died out without contributing to later populations, but we have no evidence they died out. We just stopped finding their fossils. Maybe they were absorbed into later populations, maybe they interbred with the Neanderthals who also lived in the region, maybe they moved somewhere else. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, it's just absence, and that's the fundamental problem with building human origin stories from fragmentary fossils separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles. We're trying to reconstruct a continuous process from a handful of snapshots. We're trying to draw lines between points when we can't see most of the actual path. The fossils are breadcrumbs, not the full trail. And when those breadcrumbs start showing up in places they're not supposed to be, at times they're not supposed to exist, it suggests the trail we've been imagining might be completely wrong. The Out of Africa theory was built on the evidence available in the 1980s and 90s. At that time, the oldest clear Homo sapiens fossils were from East Africa, and dated to around 200,000 years ago. The oldest modern humans outside Africa were from the Middle East and dated to around 100,000 years ago. The genetic evidence seemed to show a recent expansion out of Africa. Everything fit together into a coherent story. But science doesn't stop. New techniques allow better dating. New fossil sites get discovered. Ancient DNA becomes extractable and sequenceable. And the more data we gather, the less the simple story holds up. Each new discovery doesn't just add detail, it challenges core assumptions. Morocco challenges the idea of a single origin point. Mislia challenges the timing of the out-of-Africa migration. Apodema, if confirmed, challenges whether Africa even was the sole source of modern humans. These discoveries don't mean out of Africa is wrong. Africa clearly played a crucial role in human evolution. The genetic evidence still shows that most of our ancestry traces back to African populations. But simple out of Africa, the idea of a single origin point and a single migration wave that replaced everyone everywhere, that's looking increasingly untenable. The real story was more complex, more distributed, more entangled with all the other human populations that existed across the old world for hundreds of thousands of years. The foundation is cracking. Not collapsing, but cracking. Enough that we can't keep building on it without acknowledging the structural problems. Enough that we need to stop treating out of Africa as settled science and start treating it as what it always should have been, a working hypothesis. A useful model, a story that explained the evidence we had until we got better evidence. And now we have better evidence, and it's telling us something different. In 2010, everything changed. Not gradually, not through accumulation of small evidence, but suddenly, dramatically, through the publication of a single paper in the journal Science. The Neanderthal genome had been sequenced. Not fragments, not pieces, but a complete draft genome extracted from bones that had been buried in caves for tens of thousands of years. The technical achievement alone was remarkable. Ancient DNA degrades. It breaks down into smaller and smaller fragments. It gets contaminated with bacterial DNA, fungal DNA, DNA from every organism that's colonized the bones since burial. Extracting clean sequences from samples that old seemed nearly impossible. But Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig had done it. They'd developed techniques to isolate authentic ancient DNA, to reconstruct genomic sequences from tiny degraded fragments, to essentially resurrect the genetic blueprint of an extinct human species. When they started the project, they expected to find what everyone expected. Neanderthals and modern humans were separate species, closely related, sure, sharing a common ancestor maybe 400,000 years ago, but separate, distinct. The out-of-Africa model predicted complete replacement. Modern humans came out of Africa and wiped out the Neanderthals without interbreeding. No gene flow, no mixing. Clean extinction. The genome told a different story. When the team compared the Neanderthal DNA sequence to the genomes of living people from around the world, they found something nobody was prepared for. Non-Africans had Neanderthal DNA, not a tiny amount, not trace contamination, but 1 to 4% of their genome came from Neanderthal ancestors. Everyone of European ancestry, everyone of Asian ancestry, everyone whose ancestors lived outside Africa for the last 50,000 years, they all carried genetic sequences inherited from Neanderthals. The implications hit the field like a bomb. Complete replacement was wrong. Modern humans hadn't simply driven Neanderthals to extinction through competition. They'd interbred with them. They'd mated with them. They'd produced fertile offspring who survived and reproduced and passed Neanderthal DNA down through thousands of generations to the present day. Every person alive today of non-African descent carries genetic material from Neanderthals. You, if your ancestry isn't entirely from sub-Saharan Africa, are part Neanderthal. The patterns in the data told the story of when and where this happened. Sub-Saharan Africans had little to no Neanderthal DNA. Europeans and Asians had similar amounts, despite Neanderthals being primarily European. This suggested the interbreeding happened early, probably in the Middle East, before modern humans split into populations that would migrate to Europe versus Asia. Sometime around 50,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier, modern humans coming out of Africa encountered Neanderthals who'd been living in the Middle East and Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. And instead of fighting to extinction, instead of maintaining species boundaries through reproductive isolation, they bred. We don't know what these encounters looked like. We don't know if it was peaceful or violent, consensual or coercive, common or rare. The genetic data doesn't preserve those details. What it shows is the outcome: gene flow from Neanderthals into the modern human population. Enough that Neanderthal DNA became a permanent part of the human genome. Enough that those Neanderthal genes were sometimes beneficial, sometimes neutral, occasionally harmful. Natural selection has been working on this Neanderthal ancestry for 50,000 years, eliminating the harmful stuff, keeping the useful stuff, letting the neutral stuff drift. Some of the Neanderthal genes we carry are clearly adaptive. They helped our ancestors survive in the new environments they encountered outside Africa. Genes affecting skin and hair, helping people adapt to different climates and UV radiation levels. Genes affecting immune function, providing resistance to pathogens that Neanderthals had been dealing with for hundreds of thousands of years but that African humans had never encountered. Some researchers think Neanderthal immune genes helped modern humans survive the disease burden of Eurasia. We inherited their immunological experience encoded in DNA. But here's what really matters for our story. If modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, then the replacement model is wrong. Replacement means one species completely replaces another without genetic exchange. What actually happened was assimilation. Modern humans didn't replace Neanderthals so much as absorb them. The Neanderthals didn't go extinct, they were incorporated. Their genetic legacy lives on in billions of people today. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Species, by definition, are reproductively isolated. If two populations can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, they're not really separate species, they're subspecies or populations of the same species. But Neanderthals and modern humans had been evolving separately for at least 400,000 years. They looked different. Their skulls were shaped differently, their bodies were built differently. They lived in different ways, made different tools, apparently had different cultures. If any two groups of humans seemed like distinct species, it was modern humans and Neanderthals. Yet they bred, successfully, repeatedly, over a long enough period that multiple interbreeding events left marks across the genome. This meant the species boundary between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis was permeable, fuzzy, more like a population distinction than a hard speciation event. And if the boundary between modern humans and Neanderthals was fuzzy, what about the boundaries between modern humans and all the other archaic human populations that existed when our ancestors left Africa? The answer came in 2010, the same year as the Neanderthal genome paper. Another team, also working with the ancient DNA, announced they'd sequenced DNA from a tiny finger bone found in Denisova Cave in southern Siberia. The bone was small, probably from a child, and had been found mixed with animal bones in sediment layers 40,000 to 50,000 years old. They expected it to be Neanderthal. Neanderthals lived in that region at that time, but when they sequenced the DNA, it didn't match Neanderthals. It didn't match modern humans either. It was something else, something unknown, an entirely new human species discovered not through fossils but through genetics. They called them Denisovans, after the cave. The Denisovan genome was distantly related to Neanderthals. The two groups shared a common ancestor that lived maybe 400,000 years ago. After that split, Neanderthals spread across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans apparently spread through Eastern Asia. We still don't have good fossils of them. We have that finger bone, a few teeth, a piece of skull. Nothing that would tell us what they looked like or how they lived. But we have their genome, and that genome tells a remarkable story. When researchers compared the Denisovan sequence to modern humans, they found something extraordinary. Melanesians, people from Papua New Guinea and nearby islands, had Denisovan DNA. Not a little. 4 to 6% of their genome came from Denisovan ancestors. This was even more than the Neanderthal contribution in Europeans. Aboriginal Australians also had Denisovan DNA. So did some Southeast Asian populations. The pattern was clear. Modern humans had encountered Denisovans somewhere in Eastern Asia and interbred with them, just as other modern human populations had interbred with Neanderthals in the West. This doubled the interbreeding story. Modern humans coming out of Africa didn't just meet and mix with one archaic human population, They met and mixed with at least two: Neanderthals in the west, Denisovans in the east. And these weren't minor encounters. These weren't rare hybridization events that barely left a mark. These were sustained contacts over thousands of years that resulted in significant gene flow into the modern human population. Enough that the descendants carried that archaic DNA across the globe and down through hundreds of generations. Think about what this means for the Out of Africa narrative. The story was that modern humans left Africa and replaced everyone they met. Superior technology, superior cognition, superior something that let them outcompete and drive to extinction all the archaic humans who'd been living outside Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. But the genetic evidence says otherwise. Modern humans met archaic humans and interbred with them, successfully, repeatedly, and the genes from those archaic humans helped the modern human populations adapt to new environments. This isn't replacement. This is assimilation. This is a more complex, more interesting, more human story than simple conquest. And it gets more complex still. Because Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with each other too. In 2018, researchers announced they'd found a bone fragment from Denisova Cave that belonged to a teenage girl who had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. A first-generation hybrid. Direct evidence that these different human groups weren't just occasionally interbreeding with modern humans, they were interbreeding with each other. The picture emerging from ancient DNA is of a complex web of human populations spread across the old world, all related, all capable of interbreeding, all exchanging genes when they came into contact. Not separate species divided by reproductive barriers, but populations of a complex, widespread human lineage that had diversified into distinct forms, but maintained enough genetic similarity to produce viable offspring. The boundaries between these groups were social and cultural and geographical, not biological. And there's more. In 2020, a team led by Aaron Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman announced they'd found evidence of another archaic population. This one was in Africa. By analysing the genomes of modern West African populations, they detected stretches of DNA that didn't fit with known human ancestry. The sequences were too divergent, too archaic. They seemed to come from a population that split from the ancestors of modern humans between 360,000 and 1 million years ago. A ghost population. We don't have fossils of them. We don't know what they looked like or where exactly they lived. But we can see their genetic footprints in living people. The analysis suggested that 6 to 7% of the genome in some West African populations came from this unknown archaic source. That's more than the Neanderthal contribution in Europeans. This was major admixture. And it happened in Africa, not outside it. Modern humans or their immediate ancestors apparently interbred with archaic humans inside Africa before any migrations out of the continent. The clean African origin, the idea that Homo sapiens evolved in isolation in Africa and then spread, that's wrong. Even in Africa, modern humans were mixing with other human populations. This pattern repeats across the genetic data. Every time researchers look closely at a population, they find evidence of archaic admixture. Sometimes it's Neanderthal, sometimes it's Denisovan, sometimes it's unknown ghost populations that we can detect genetically but haven't found fossils of. The human genome is a mosaic. Mostly derived from anatomically modern humans who lived in Africa, yes, but with significant contributions from archaic humans across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some researchers estimate that up to 20% of the Neanderthal genome survives scattered across living people. No single person has all of it. But collectively, modern humans carry a substantial fraction of the Neanderthal genetic legacy. The Neanderthals didn't go extinct. They were absorbed into the modern human population through interbreeding. Their genes live on. Their descendants are us. This completely changes how we understand the relationship between modern humans and other human species. The Out of Africa model framed it as replacement. We came, we saw, we conquered, they vanished. But the genetic reality is more nuanced. We came, we met, we interbred, we absorbed. Some archaic populations contributed more genes than others. Some regions saw more admixture than others. Some genes from archaic humans were beneficial and increased in frequency. Others were harmful and were eliminated by natural selection. But the overall pattern is clear. Human evolution wasn't a process of one superior species replacing inferior ones. It was a process of diverse human populations encountering each other and merging. The Interbreeding Revolution didn't just change how we understand human origins, it changed what it means to be human. We're not pure Homo sapiens, descendants of a single African population that evolved in isolation. We're hybrids, the product of multiple ancient human lineages that came back together after hundreds of thousands of years of separation. Every person of non-African descent carries DNA from Neanderthals who lived in Ice Age Europe. Many people carry DNA from Denisovans who lived in ancient Asia. People in Africa carry DNA from unknown archaic humans who lived across the continent. We're all living mosaics of ancient human diversity, and this has implications that go far beyond academic debates about human origins. If we're all hybrids, all carrying genes from multiple ancient populations, then the idea of racial purity is nonsense. There's no pure human lineage. We're all mixed, all carrying genetic heritage from diverse sources. The differences between modern populations, the variation in skin color and facial features and body proportions, those are recent adaptations to different environments overlaid on an ancient foundation of shared and mixed ancestry. The Interbreeding Revolution proved that the simple, out-of-Africa story, the one where modern humans evolved in Africa and then spread across the world replacing everyone else, that story is wrong. The real story involves multiple human populations, multiple migrations, multiple episodes of interbreeding and gene flow. It's messier, it's more complicated, it doesn't fit neatly into a single narrative with clear heroes and villains, conquerors and conquered. But it's what actually happened, and it's what the genetic data keeps showing more clearly with every new ancient genome sequenced, every new population analysed, every new comparison made. We didn't replace Neanderthals and Denisovans and other archaic humans. We merged with them. Their genetic legacy is part of who we are today, and that means human evolution was never about one group winning. It was always about different human populations coming together, sharing genes, creating something new from the mixture of the old. Let's talk about what the out-of-Africa theory actually claimed. Not the simplified version, not the popular understanding, but the specific scientific hypothesis that became dominant in the 1990s. It proposed that anatomically modern Homo sapiens evolved in one place, probably somewhere in East Africa, probably around 200,000 years ago. This founding population was small, isolated, genetically homogeneous. From this single point of origin, modern humans gradually spread across Africa, and then, much later, expanded out of Africa to populate the rest of the world. The key word there is single, one origin point, one founding population. One evolutionary event that created our species. Everything about modern human diversity, all the physical and genetic variation we see across populations today, arose after this origin event through adaptation to different environments. But the origin itself was singular, localized, confined to a specific region that could, in theory, be identified and studied. This made for a compelling narrative. It gave us a homeland, a place we could point to and say, that's where humanity began. The Ethiopian highlands, the Rift Valley, the grasslands of East Africa. This is where we evolved, where the first true humans looked out across the savannah and took their first steps toward becoming us. It was poetic, it was powerful, and increasingly it looks like it was wrong. The genetic data that initially supported the single origin model came from mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes. Both of these genetic systems are useful for tracking ancestry because they don't recombine. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child unchanged except for mutations. Y chromosomes pass from father to son the same way. This makes them excellent for building family trees, for tracing lineages back through time. And when researchers did this in the 1980s and 90s, they found that all modern human mitochondrial DNA traced back to Africa, and all Y chromosomes did too. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. These became shorthand for the out-of-Africa theory. Everyone's maternal lineage goes back to a woman who lived in Africa maybe 150,000 years ago. Everyone's paternal lineage goes back to a man who lived in Africa maybe 70,000 years ago. Therefore humans must have originated in Africa and spread from there. Simple, clear, convincing. Except it's not that simple, because mitochondrial Eve wasn't the only woman alive at her time. She was just the woman whose mitochondrial lineage survived to the present, while all other contemporary female lineages died out. This happens randomly in any population. Some lineages persist, others don't. The fact that all living mitochondrial DNA traces back to Africa doesn't mean that's where all humans evolved. It just means that's where the successful mitochondrial lineage originated. And here's the crucial point. Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes represent a tiny fraction of your genome. Mitochondrial DNA is about 16,000 base pairs. Your nuclear genome is 3 billion base pairs. The mitochondrial DNA is 0.005% of your total genetic information. The Y chromosome is slightly larger but still represents less than 2% of the genome. Basing human origins on these two small genetic systems while ignoring the other 98% of the genome is like trying to understand a book by reading 2 random pages. When researchers started looking at the whole genome, the picture got much more complicated. Nuclear DNA doesn't have a single family tree. It has thousands of family trees, one for every independently inherited segment of the genome. And these trees have different shapes. Some trace back to recent common ancestors, others trace back to much more ancient splits. Some show recent African ancestry, others show much deeper structure suggesting old population divisions that predate the supposed origin of Homo sapiens. A study published in 2023 by Aaron Ragsdale and Simon Gravel analysed hundreds of genomes from across Africa. They used sophisticated modelling to reconstruct the demographic history of African populations. What they found was striking. The data didn't fit a model of a single origin point. Instead, it fit a model of multiple populations distributed across Africa, populations that were genetically distinct but stayed in contact, interbreeding occasionally, maintaining enough gene flow to remain part of the same species, but evolving separately enough to accumulate significant differences. This is called population structure. And the African data shows deep population structure going back hundreds of thousands of years. Long before the supposed origin of Homo sapiens, African populations were already divided into distinct groups living in different regions with different adaptations. These groups weren't isolated. They weren't separate species, but they were different enough that mixing between them left detectable marks in modern genomes. Eleanor Scarey, an evolutionary archaeologist at the Max Planck Institute who studies African prehistory, put it bluntly. There is no single birthplace. The idea that we can point to one region, one valley, one lake system, and say that's where humans evolved, it's simply not supported by the evidence. What the evidence shows is evolution on a continental scale. Multiple populations across Africa, all evolving toward anatomical modernity, all contributing to what would eventually become Homo sapiens. This isn't a minor adjustment to the out-of-Africa model. This is a fundamental reimagining of how our species evolved. Instead of a tree with a single trunk, imagine a braided stream, multiple channels flowing separately but occasionally merging, exchanging water, splitting apart again. That's what human evolution in Africa looks like when you examine the full genomic data. Not one population evolving in isolation, but a complex web of populations evolving together across thousands of miles and hundreds of thousands of years. The fossil evidence supports this too. We've already discussed Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, 315,000 years old, showing modern features on the opposite side of Africa from where Homo sapiens was supposed to have evolved, but there are others. The Omo remains from Ethiopia, now dated to at least 230,000 years old. The Herto skulls, also from Ethiopia, at 160,000 years old. Florisbad in South Africa, at 260,000 years old. Each of these fossils shows a mix of archaic and modern features. Each represents a population that was partway through the transition to anatomical modernity, and they're scattered across the continent. South Africa to Morocco is over 4,000 miles. That's the distance from New York to London. Populations separated by that much distance, living in different environments, facing different selection pressures, couldn't have been part of a single pan-mictic population evolving together. They were distinct groups, and yet they all show movement toward the same modern human anatomy. How? The answer is gene flow. These populations weren't isolated. They were connected through intermediate populations, through migration, through the occasional long-distance movement of individuals or groups. Genes that arose in one population could spread to others through this network of connections. Beneficial mutations that appeared in Morocco could eventually make their way to South Africa. Adaptations that evolved in Ethiopia could spread west to Nigeria or south to Tanzania. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this gene flow would synchronize evolution across the continent, pushing all these populations towards similar endpoints without requiring them to be part of a single local population. This is sometimes called the African multi-regional model, but that name is misleading because it suggests something similar to the old multi-regional model that proposed separate evolution in different continents. The African model is different. It proposes multiple populations within Africa, all evolving together, all exchanging genes, all part of the same broad species but with substantial local variation. It's multi-regional only in the sense that the regions are all in Africa. The genetic diversity data strongly supports this model. Africa has more genetic diversity than any other continent. Much more. If you compare genetic variation within Africa to genetic variation outside Africa, Africans are far more diverse. This makes sense if Africa is humanity's homeland, but the pattern of that diversity is revealing. It's not centered on one region. It's not highest in East Africa and decreasing as you move away from the supposed origin point. Instead, diversity is high across multiple African regions, suggesting multiple ancient population centers rather than expansion from a single source. Different African populations also have different amounts of archaic admixture from unknown sources. We mentioned the ghost population that contributed to West African genomes, but there are hints of other archaic populations in other regions. Central African populations show genetic patterns suggesting deep population structure and possible admixture with archaic groups. Eastern African populations have their own unique genetic signatures. Southern African populations, particularly groups like the Khoisan, have some of the oldest genetic lineages in the world, lineages that split from other African populations hundreds of thousands of years ago. This diversity isn't just interesting, it's incompatible with a recent single origin. If all modern humans descended from a small founding population that lived 200,000 years ago in one region, the genetic diversity should be much lower, and it should show a clear pattern of expansion from that origin point. Instead, what we see is high diversity across multiple regions, with complex patterns of relatedness, suggesting long-term population structure. Archaeological evidence adds another layer to this picture. The Middle Stone Age in Africa, the period when anatomically modern humans were evolving, shows regional variation in tool technologies and behaviors. Different regions developed different stone tool industries. Different symbolic artifacts appear at different times in different places. There's no single center of innovation from which new technologies spread. Instead, innovation appears to happen independently in multiple locations, suggesting multiple population centers with their own cultural trajectories. Taken together, the genetic, fossil, and archaeological evidence paints a picture that's fundamentally different from the single origin model. Rather than Homo sapiens evolving in one place and then spreading, we see multiple populations across Africa all evolving modern features, all developing modern behaviors, all connected enough through gene flow to remain part of the same species, but distinct enough to maintain regional variation. This is what Jean-Jacques Goublin meant when he said modern humans had a Pan-African origin. The species didn't arise in a Garden of Eden somewhere in East Africa. It arose across the continent from a network of interconnected populations. Some of these populations contributed more to modern humans than others. Some left more descendants, some had favourable adaptations that spread widely through gene flow. But there was no single founding population, no single origin event, just a gradual emergence of modern human anatomy and behaviour across Africa over hundreds of thousands of years. This model explains several things that the single origin model struggled with. It explains why the oldest fossils showing modern features are scattered across Africa rather than concentrated in one region. It explains the high genetic diversity in Africa and the complex patterns of relatedness between populations. It explains why different modern features appear at different times in different fossils. Some populations evolved small faces earlier, others evolved high foreheads earlier, others evolved modern brain shapes earlier. Through interbreeding, these features eventually came together into the full package we call anatomically modern Homo sapiens. It also changes how we think about the out-of-Africa migration. If there wasn't a single origin point in Africa, then there probably wasn't a single out-of-Africa migration either. Multiple populations living across Africa, some of them close to the northeastern edge of the continent, near the gateway to the Middle East. It makes sense that some of these populations would occasionally move into Asia, either pushed by climate changes or pulled by resource opportunities. These movements might have happened multiple times over hundreds of thousands of years. The Missler jaw we discussed, the one from Israel dated to 177,000 years ago, doesn't have to be a failed-out migration anymore. It could be one of multiple early expansions from northeastern African populations. Some of these expansions might have failed, populations dying out or being absorbed back into African gene pools. Others might have established persistent populations in the Middle East and beyond. The successful out-of-Africa migration that led to non-African populations today might have been just the most recent and largest of many such movements. This is a messier story than the clean single origin narrative. It doesn't give us a specific place to point to as humanity's birthplace. It doesn't give us a clear timeline of when our species began. It requires us to accept uncertainty, to acknowledge that human origins involved processes too complex and too distributed, to reduce to simple statements like humans evolved in East Africa 200,000 years ago. But it's what the evidence shows, and if we're serious about understanding where we came from, we have to follow the evidence even when it leads us away from the comfortable stories we'd prefer to tell. The truth is that Homo sapiens didn't originate in one place. We emerge from multiple populations across an entire continent, populations connected by gene flow, shaped by their different environments, contributing unevenly to the modern gene pool, but all part of the complex braided stream of human evolution in Africa. There's no single birthplace of humanity. There's just Africa, vast and diverse, home to multiple human populations for millions of years, home to the emergence of anatomically modern humans from those diverse populations over hundreds of thousands of years. That's our origin, not a point, a process, not a place, a continent. Now let's turn east. Because while the debate over African origins was raging, while researchers were arguing about single origins versus Pan-African evolution, something strange was happening in Asia. Fossils were showing up. Tools were appearing. Evidence was accumulating that human evolution in Asia was far more complex, far older, and far more relevant to modern human origins than the out-of-Africa model ever allowed. The standard story says that archaic humans left Africa about 2 million years ago. Homo erectus, the first truly cosmopolitan human species, spread across Asia and into Europe. For the next 1.5 million years, these archaic populations lived in Asia, slowly evolving, adapting to local conditions, but remaining fundamentally archaic. Then, around 70,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans arrived from Africa, swept across the continent, and drove these archaic Asians to extinction. Simple replacement. The Asian archaic humans contributed nothing to modern populations except maybe some fossils. But here's what we're finding. The timeline doesn't work. The fossils don't fit. The genetic evidence keeps pointing to deeper, more complex interactions between African and Asian populations than simple replacement allows. And the more we look, the more it appears that Asia wasn't just a stage where the African story played out. Asia was its own theatre of human evolution, with its own plot lines that intersected with, but weren't determined by what was happening in Africa. Start with the stone tools. In Atirampakam, India, researchers found Middle Paleolithic stone tools dated to 385,000 years ago. These aren't the simple choppers and hand axes associated with Homo erectus. These are sophisticated tools showing levallois technique, a method of carefully preparing stone cores before striking off flakes. This technology appears in Africa around 300,000 years ago, associated with early Homo sapiens or their immediate ancestors. Finding it in India 385,000 years ago suggests either very early migration from Africa or independent invention in Asia. Either way, it doesn't fit the timeline. More tools. In Jebel Faya in the United Arab Emirates, stone tools dated to 125,000 years ago show technological similarities to African Middle Stone Age industries. The implication is that modern humans, or near-modern humans, were in Arabia over 100,000 years ago, using African-style technology, 50,000 years before the supposed out-of-Africa migration. The site is strategically located near the Bab el-Mandab Strait, the narrow waterway between Africa and Arabia. During ice ages, when sea levels dropped, this strait was even narrower, perhaps even crossable. It's a perfect corridor for early human dispersal. Yemen yields similar evidence. Stone tools from the site of Al-Wusta dated to 86,000 years ago. These tools are associated with a single human finger bone showing modern human anatomy. So by 86,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were deep into Arabia, 1,000 miles from Africa, using sophisticated stone technology. This is pre-out of Africa by the standard timeline. These shouldn't exist. China presents even bigger problems for the simple narrative. Stone tools from Wanglong Cave in Hubei province have been dated to 80,000 years ago or possibly earlier. Human teeth from the same general region show modern morphology and date to between 80,000 and 120,000 years ago. The Lujiang skull from southern China has been contentiously dated anywhere from 67,000 to 159,000 years ago, with the older dates being increasingly supported by newer analyses. If modern humans were in southern China 159,000 years ago, they got there long before the supposed out-of-Africa migration, and they would have had to pass through India, Southeast Asia, perhaps Indonesia. That's thousands of miles of travel through diverse environments, requiring adaptation, technology, and probably interbreeding with the local archaic populations they encountered. None of this fits with a simple 70,000-year-old migration that rapidly replaced everyone. Southeast Asia adds its own complications. The region is an archipelago, hundreds of islands scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. During ice ages, sea levels dropped, connecting some islands into larger landmasses. Sundayland, as geologists call it, connected modern Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of the Philippines into a single continental block. This created land bridges but also left water barriers between island groups. Crossing these barriers required boats or rafts, suggesting cognitive sophistication and technological capability. Evidence of human occupation in Southeast Asia goes back much further than out of Africa allows. Homo erectus reached Java by at least 1.5 million years ago. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, lived on the island of Flores until at least 50,000 years ago, maybe more recently. Denisovans, we now know from genetic evidence, were widespread across the region. And modern humans, or near-modern humans, may have been there far earlier than 70,000 years ago. A jawbone from Tampaling Cave in Laos, dated to between 46,000 and 63,000 years ago, shows fully modern human anatomy. Philippine fossil sites have yielded remains of Homo luzonensis, a distinct species that lived as recently as 50,000 years ago. These aren't relict populations of Homo erectus. These are unique human species that evolved on islands, probably from earlier hominin colonists, developing their own distinctive features in isolation. The picture emerging from Southeast Asia is of a complex mosaic of human populations, Homo erectus descendants persisting in some areas, Denisovans in others, unique island species like Floresiensis and Luzonensis, and modern humans arriving in multiple waves, possibly from multiple source populations, interacting with all these groups in ways that left genetic signatures in modern populations. Australian Aboriginals add another layer to the mystery. Genetic evidence clearly shows that Aboriginal Australians descend primarily from the out-of-Africa migration, arriving in Australia somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago, but they also carry significant Denisovan DNA, more than any other population except Melanesians. Where did they encounter Denisovans? Probably somewhere in Southeast Asia during their migration from Africa to Australia. But this means Denisovans were widespread enough across Southeast Asia 50 to 60,000 years ago to interbreed with multiple passing populations of modern humans. And there are hints, controversial but persistent, of even earlier human presence in Australia. Stone tools from some Australian sites have been claimed to date back 120,000 years or more. These dates are disputed, relying on methods that some researchers consider unreliable. But if even partially correct, they would suggest human presence in Australia long before the accepted timeline allows. Reaching Australia from Asia requires crossing water barriers that don't disappear even during the lowest sea level stands. Someone had to build boats and navigate across open ocean. If this happened 120,000 years ago, it represents cognitive sophistication far earlier than usually assumed. China presents another puzzle with implications for human evolution. The Denisovan DNA found in modern humans matches most closely to the Denisovan genome from Siberia. But other Denisovan fossils, a jawbone from Tibet, show that Denisovans lived across a huge geographic range, and genetic analysis suggests there were multiple Denisovan populations, some more closely related to modern Melanesians than the Siberian Denisovans were. This indicates a long history of Denisovan evolution and diversification in Asia, with different populations following different evolutionary trajectories. Some researchers have proposed that what we call Denisovans might actually be a grade rather than a single species. A catch-all category for diverse archaic human populations in Asia that shared some features but weren't necessarily each other's closest relatives. If true, this would mean Asia hosted multiple distinct human lineages, all evolving from earlier Homo erectus populations, all present when modern humans arrived, all potential sources of admixture. The genetic evidence for this is compelling. Modern Melanesians carry Denisovan DNA that comes from at least 2 separate admixture events, with 2 different Denisovan populations. One of these Denisovan sources was already mixed with Neanderthal genes, indicating complex patterns of interbreeding between archaic groups before modern humans even arrived. The other Denisovan source was genetically distinct, suggesting different populations separated by geography or time. This is not what Simple Out of Africa predicts. The model says modern humans left Africa, encountered Neanderthals in the west and possibly one archaic group in the east, and replaced them. But the Asian data shows multiple distinct human populations, multiple episodes of interbreeding, complex patterns of gene flow that require different human groups to remain in contact over long periods. It suggests a much longer, much more complex history of human presence and interaction in Asia than a simple 70,000-year-old expansion allows. There's also the problem of continuity. Some fossils from Asia show features that appear in both archaic and modern populations from the same region, suggesting possible regional continuity rather than complete replacement. The Lujiang skull from China, for example, has some features that appear in earlier Chinese Homo erectus fossils, as well as in modern Chinese populations. The Tianyuan man, from China, and dated to about 40,000 years ago, shows genetic links to modern East Asians and Native Americans, but also some archaic anatomical features. Multi-regionalists like Milford Wolpoff have long pointed to these apparent continuities as evidence that Asian Homo erectus populations contributed genetically to modern Asian populations. The Out of Africa model dismissed this, arguing that anatomical similarities were coincidental or due to shared developmental pathways rather than genetic continuity. But with the discovery of substantial Denisovan admixture in modern populations, the question has to be revisited. If modern humans were interbreeding with Denisovans in Asia, and Denisovans were descendants of Asian Homo erectus, then modern Asians do carry genetic material from Asian archaic humans. The continuity might be real. This doesn't mean multi-regional evolution was right in its original form. Modern humans are clearly primarily descended from African populations. The genetic data on that point is overwhelming. But it does mean that Asian archaic humans weren't simply replaced. They contributed. Their genes persist in modern populations. Some of their anatomical features might persist too, incorporated into modern human populations through interbreeding. The timing of human arrival in Asia also keeps getting pushed back. Every few years, a new discovery extends the range. Modern humans in Israel at 177,000 years, tools in Arabia at 125,000, possible modern humans in southern China at 120,000 or even earlier. Each of these discoveries was initially met with skepticism. Many still are. But the pattern is consistent. Earlier and earlier evidence of modern or near-modern human presence in Asia. Part of the problem is dating. Accurately dating fossils and archaeological sites older than about 50,000 years is difficult. Radiocarbon dating only works back to about 50,000 years. Beyond that, researchers rely on other methods like uranium series dating, thermoluminescence, or electron spin resonance. These methods are less precise and more prone to error, but they're improving, and as they improve, the early dates are being confirmed more often than they're being refuted. Another part of the problem is defining what counts as modern human. If we use a strict anatomical definition, looking for the full suite of modern features, then many of these early Asian fossils don't qualify. They're intermediate, showing some modern features but retaining archaic ones. But if human evolution in Africa involved gradual emergence of modernity across multiple populations, as we discussed in the previous chapter, then we should expect the same in Asia. Populations at various stages of the transition toward modernity, some more advanced, some less, all interbreeding and exchanging genes, all part of the broader human evolutionary process. The Asian evidence doesn't overturn out of Africa entirely, but it complicates it enormously. It suggests multiple migrations from Africa at different times. It suggests long periods of coexistence between modern and archaic humans in Asia. It suggests substantial gene flow between these populations, not just a one-way replacement. And it suggests that some modern human populations, particularly those in East Asia and Oceania, carry significant genetic and possibly even anatomical heritage from Asian archaic humans. Asia wasn't just a stage, it was a player. Human evolution in Asia over the last 2 million years shaped the modern human genome in ways we're only beginning to understand. The story isn't African humans conquering Asia. It's African and Asian populations encountering each other, mixing, creating hybrid populations that carried genes from both lineages. The Asian mystery isn't really a mystery. It's just evidence that human evolution was never as simple as out of Africa alone suggested. It was global, complex, deeply interconnected across continents and populations and hundreds of thousands of years. Let's talk about what headlines say versus what the actual genetic data shows. Because there's a gap, a big one, and understanding that gap is crucial to understanding why the simple out of Africa story has become so complicated. When you read popular accounts of human origins, they make it sound certain, definitive. DNA proves we all came from Africa. Mitochondrial Eve confirms it. Y chromosome Adam confirms it. The science is settled. Case closed. Except that's not quite what the DNA says. What the DNA actually says is more nuanced, more complex, and in many ways more uncertain than the headlines suggest. Yes, the genetic evidence strongly supports African origins for most modern human ancestry, but most is not all. And the patterns in the data reveal a history far messier than simple expansion from a single African population. Start with mitochondrial Eve. The concept is simple enough. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally, passed from mother to all her children, but only passed on by daughters. If you trace everyone's mitochondrial DNA back through time, all lineages eventually converge on a single woman. This woman, dubbed mitochondrial Eve, lived somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago, probably in Africa based on where the deepest mitochondrial lineages are found today. But here's what mitochondrial Eve doesn't mean. She wasn't the only woman alive at her time. She wasn't the first woman. She wasn't even necessarily special in any way except that her mitochondrial lineage happened to survive to the present, while other contemporary women's lineages didn't. Every woman alive at the same time as mitochondrial Eve could have been equally important to human ancestry. Some of them probably contributed far more nuclear DNA to modern humans than Eve did, but their mitochondrial lineages died out, either through random chance or because they had only sons at some point, breaking the maternal chain. This is a crucial distinction. Mitochondrial DNA represents one tiny sliver of your ancestry, your maternal line, your mother's mother's mother going back thousands of generations. But you have many other ancestors, your father's mother's mother, your mother's father's mother. All the other lineages that contributed to your nuclear genome. Mitochondrial Eve tells us something about one lineage. She doesn't tell us the whole story of human origins. The same applies to Y chromosome Adam. This is the most recent common ancestor of all human Y chromosomes, the man from whom all modern Y chromosomes descend. He lived somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago, also probably in Africa. But just like mitochondrial Eve, he wasn't the only man alive at his time. Other men contributed just as much to modern human nuclear DNA. But their Y chromosomes didn't survive, either lost through having only daughters or through random lineage extinction. So when headlines say DNA proves all humans came from Africa, what they really mean is that two very specific genetic systems, mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes, which represent tiny fractions of our total ancestry, trace back to Africa. This is consistent with African origins. but it doesn't prove that all human ancestry is African, or that humans evolved in a single location in Africa. When you look at nuclear DNA, the picture gets much more complex. Nuclear DNA doesn't have a single family tree. Every segment of the genome has its own history, its own coalescence point, its own most recent common ancestor. Some of these segments coalesce recently, within the last few 100,000 years. Others coalesce much more anciently, over 1 million years ago, back to times when the ancestors of modern humans weren't even anatomically modern yet. This variation in coalescence times reveals something important. The ancestral human population wasn't a single homogeneous group. It was structured, subdivided. Different subpopulations existed separated by geography or ecology, exchanging genes occasionally, but maintaining distinct identities for long periods. When populations are structured like this, different parts of the genome retain signatures of that ancient structure. And that's exactly what we see in modern human DNA. Studies of African genetic diversity show this clearly. The oldest, most divergent genetic lineages exist in Africa, particularly in populations like the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa and various Central African groups. These lineages split from other human lineages hundreds of thousands of years ago, suggesting long-term population divisions within Africa. The genetic differences between some African populations are larger than the differences between non-African populations, indicating that African genetic diversity represents a much longer evolutionary history than the diversity outside Africa. But here's the key point. This diversity doesn't fit a model of recent expansion from a single source population. If all modern humans descended from a small founding population 200,000 years ago that then expanded across Africa, before some left for other continents, the genetic diversity should show a clear pattern of expansion from that origin point. Diversity should be highest near the origin and decrease with distance. Instead, diversity is high across multiple African regions, with complex patterns of relatedness that suggest multiple ancient populations contributing to modern Africans. Genomic studies have identified what researchers call ghost populations in African ancestry. These are populations that we can detect genetically but don't have clear fossil or archaeological evidence for. They show up as statistical anomalies in genetic data, stretches of DNA that don't fit with known human populations, and suggested mixture from divergent human groups. Some of these ghost populations split from modern human ancestors 300,000 years ago or more, yet they contributed DNA to modern African populations, indicating interbreeding between anatomically modern and archaic humans within Africa. One study estimated that about 6 to 7% of West African ancestry comes from an unknown archaic population that diverged from modern humans between 360,000 and 1 million years ago. That's a substantial contribution, and it's not from Neanderthals or Denisovans, who lived outside Africa. This is an African archaic population, probably descended from earlier African hominins, that survived long enough to interbreed with anatomically modern humans emerging in Africa. Other African populations show similar signatures of archaic admixture, though from different source populations. The genetic patterns suggest multiple archaic groups existed across Africa, each contributing to modern populations in their regions. This is consistent with the Pan-African evolution model we discussed earlier. Multiple populations evolving toward modernity, some more quickly than others, all interbreeding, all contributing genes to the final modern human gene pool. Outside Africa, the genetic story is dominated by the bottleneck effect of the out-of-Africa migration. When a small population leaves a larger source population and founds a new population, it carries only a subset of the original genetic diversity. This founder effect reduces diversity in the new population. And that's exactly what we see. Non-African populations have less genetic diversity than African populations, consistent with descent from a small founding group that left Africa. But even this out-of-Africa signal is more complex than usually acknowledged. Genetic analysis suggests there may have been multiple bottlenecks, not just one. The main out-of-Africa migration around 50 to 70,000 years ago is clear in the data. But there are hints of earlier bottlenecks, earlier migrations that might have contributed to non-African ancestry. Some genetic lineages outside Africa coalesce too anciently to fit comfortably with a single recent migration. They suggest either earlier exits from Africa or more complex demographic history with multiple founding events. The Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture we discussed earlier adds another layer. These aren't trivial genetic contributions. 1 to 4% Neanderthal ancestry means hundreds of Neanderthal gene variants in every non-African person's genome. Some of these variants have been under positive selection, meaning they were beneficial and increased in frequency. Neanderthal genes affect immune function, skin pigmentation, hair texture, metabolism, and even some aspects of brain development. This isn't just genetic noise, it's functional ancestry that shaped how modern human populations adapted to non-African environments. The Denisovan contribution, while restricted to certain populations, is even larger in those populations. 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry in Melanesians represents substantial genetic input. Some of this Denisovan DNA has been identified as adaptive. A gene variant that helps Tibetans survive at high altitude comes from Denisovans. It helps regulate hemoglobin production in low oxygen environments, a crucial adaptation for living on the Tibetan plateau. Without this Denisovan gene, Tibetan populations couldn't thrive at those elevations. Their ability to live where they do, to have the culture and history they have, is partly thanks to genetic input from an archaic human species we only discovered a decade ago. This raises a philosophical question. What does it mean to be human? If our genomes contain DNA from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and unknown African archaic populations, if these genetic contributions shaped our biology in functional ways, if we literally couldn't exist as we do without this archaic DNA, then are we really pure Homo sapiens? Or are we hybrids, a mosaic species created from the merger of multiple ancient human lineages? Genetically, we're definitely hybrids. The boundaries between Homo sapiens and other human species weren't absolute. They were permeable. Different human groups could interbreed and produce fertile offspring. The species categories we use, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo denisova, these are useful for organizing fossils and discussing evolution, but they're imposing artificial categories on what was actually a continuum of related populations with varying degrees of genetic divergence. Some researchers argue we should reclassify all these groups as subspecies of Homo sapiens rather than separate species. Homo sapiens sapiens for modern humans, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis for Neanderthals, Homo sapiens denisova for Denisovans. This would acknowledge that they were all part of the same broad human lineage, all capable of interbreeding, all contributing to modern humanity. The species boundaries were social and cultural and behavioral, not genetic. But even if we keep them as separate species, the genetic reality is that we're not purely descended from Homo sapiens. We're descended from Homo sapiens plus Neanderthals plus Denisovans plus unknown African archaic groups. Every person alive carries this mixed ancestry, though in different proportions depending on their population's history. We're all hybrids, and that's actually beautiful. It means human diversity, both ancient and modern, contributed to who we are today. It means we're the product of hundreds of thousands of years of different human populations encountering each other, sometimes competing, sometimes cooperating, sometimes breeding, always exchanging genes and culture and ideas. The DNA also reveals something else. Human evolution didn't stop when anatomically modern humans appeared. Natural selection has been operating on human populations continuously for the last 100,000 years or more. Different populations adapted to different environments. Some adapted to cold climates, developing body proportions that conserve heat. Others adapted to high altitudes, developing enhanced oxygen processing. Still others adapted to new diets, developing enhanced ability to digest starch or tolerate dairy. These adaptations happened recently, well after the supposed origin of Homo sapiens, meaning that human evolution is ongoing. We're still evolving. Some of the most dramatic recent evolution involves gene flow from archaic humans. After interbreeding introduced Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA into modern populations, natural selection acted on that DNA, keeping beneficial variants and eliminating harmful ones. Today, different populations have different amounts of archaic ancestry in different parts of their genomes, reflecting thousands of generations of natural selection filtering the admixture. The DNA that persists is there because it was useful. The DNA that disappeared was lost because it was harmful. This creates interesting patterns. Neanderthal DNA is depleted in genes related to testis function and X chromosomes. This suggests incompatibilities between Neanderthal and modern human genomes in reproduction, possibly causing reduced fertility in hybrids. Natural selection would have eliminated these incompatible gene variants quickly, leaving the pattern we see today. But Neanderthal DNA is enriched in genes related to skin and hair and immunity, suggesting these Neanderthal variants were beneficial and increased in frequency. The genetic evidence, when you look at it carefully, doesn't support a simple, out-of-Africa narrative. It supports something more complex. African origins for most ancestry, yes, but with substantial population structure in Africa, multiple ghost populations contributing to modern Africans, early migrations out of Africa that might have left genetic traces, interbreeding with archaic humans both in and outside Africa, ongoing evolution and adaptation in modern populations. The DNA tells a story of a species that evolved across multiple populations in multiple regions, with complex gene flow between groups, creating the genetic diversity we see today. What the DNA actually says is that human origins were messy. Multiple populations, multiple migrations, multiple interbreeding events, natural selection continuously shaping the genetic landscape. And if you want certainty, if you want a simple answer to where humans came from, the DNA won't give it to you. It'll give you probabilities, patterns, most likely scenarios. It'll tell you Africa is important, crucial even, but not the whole story. It'll reveal a complex web of ancestry that connects modern humans to multiple ancient populations across 3 continents. That's what the DNA actually says, and it's far more interesting than any headline could capture. There's a certain satisfaction in being proven right after decades of being dismissed. Milford Wolpoff probably felt something like that when the Neanderthal genome was published in 2010. For nearly 30 years, Wolpoff and his colleagues had argued that modern humans didn't simply replace archaic humans. They argued for continuity, for gene flow between populations, for a more complex picture of human evolution than out of Africa allowed. And for 30 years they were marginalized, their ideas treated as outdated holdovers from an earlier era of anthropology. The discovery of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans didn't vindicate multi-regional evolution entirely, but it proved the core insight correct. Archaic humans contributed to modern human ancestry. There was gene flow, there was continuity. The boundaries between human populations weren't absolute, and that meant the simple replacement model that dominated from the 1980s through the 2000s was wrong. Let's understand what multi-regional evolution actually proposed, because it's often misrepresented both by its critics and sometimes by its supporters. The original model, developed in the 1980s, argued that modern humans evolved simultaneously across the Old World from regional populations of Homo erectus that had left Africa over 1 million years ago. Gene flow between regions kept these populations part of the same species, but local evolution in different regions contributed to modern regional variation. Modern Chinese, for example, descended partly from Chinese Homo erectus. Modern Europeans descended partly from European archaic humans. Modern Africans descended from African archaic humans. This was the strong form of multi-regional evolution, and it had problems. The genetic evidence that emerged in the 90s and 2000s didn't support it. Mitochondrial DNA clearly showed recent African ancestry for all modern humans. The fossil record showed anatomically modern humans appearing first in Africa, not simultaneously worldwide. The stone tool evidence showed African Middle Stone Age technology spreading outward, not arising independently in multiple regions. By the early 2000s, strong multi-regionalism was effectively dead. But Wolpoff and his colleagues didn't give up. They modified the model. The new version, sometimes called weak multi-regionalism, or the assimilation model, accepted African origins for most modern human ancestry but argued that archaic humans outside Africa weren't completely replaced. Instead, they were assimilated. As modern humans expanded from Africa, they interbred with local populations, incorporating some archaic genes into the modern human gene pool. Most ancestry came from Africa, but some came from regional archaic populations. This modified model was much closer to what the genetic data actually showed. And when Neanderthal admixture was discovered, weak multi-regionalism suddenly looked prescient rather than outdated. Wolpoff had been arguing for gene flow between modern and archaic humans for decades. Now the genetic data proved him right. The question was no longer whether there was admixture, but how much and what it meant for understanding human evolution. The discovery of Denisovan admixture strengthened the case further. Here was another clear example of gene flow from archaic to modern humans, and the fact that different modern populations had different amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry, with some having both, some having only Neanderthal, and some having neither, suggested complex patterns of regional admixture. Exactly what the assimilation model predicted. Then came the African ghost populations, evidence of archaic admixture within Africa itself. This was crucial because it showed that even in Africa, modern humans weren't evolving in isolation. They were encountering and interbreeding with archaic populations. The pattern that multi-regionalists had proposed for Eurasia applied in Africa too. Human evolution everywhere involved mixing between modern and archaic forms. So is multi-regional evolution making a comeback? Sort of. Not in its strong form. Nobody seriously argues anymore that modern humans evolved simultaneously across the old world from separate Homo erectus populations. The genetic evidence against that is overwhelming. Africa clearly played a central role. Most modern human ancestry traces back to Africa. The anatomically modern human form first appeared in Africa. These are established facts that any successful model has to incorporate. But the weak form of multi-regionalism, the assimilation model, that's looking increasingly like the correct framework for understanding human origins. Modern humans evolved primarily in Africa from diverse African populations. But as they expanded out of Africa, they didn't simply replace everyone they met. They interbred with them. They assimilated them. And the genetic material from these archaic populations became part of the modern human genome, contributing to the diversity we see today. This is sometimes called the African replacement with hybridization model. It's a mouthful. But it captures the essential elements. Replacement as the dominant process. African populations expanding and becoming the majority ancestry everywhere, but with hybridization as a significant secondary process. Archaic populations contributing genes that persist in modern humans, sometimes at high enough frequencies to suggest they were beneficial. Chris Stringer, one of the leading proponents of Out of Africa, has acknowledged that the model needs to incorporate archaic admixture. He distinguishes between the classic Out of Africa model, which predicted complete replacement, and the modified version that allows for limited hybridization. Most researchers have moved to this modified position. Africa is still central. Recent African origin is still supported, but complete replacement is out. Assimilation is in. This shifts the debate from whether archaic humans contributed to modern populations, which is now settled, to how much they contributed and what that means. Is 1 to 4% Neanderthal ancestry trivial or significant? Is it enough to call modern humans hybrids? Does it justify reclassifying Neanderthals as a subspecies of Homo sapiens rather than a separate species? These are partly scientific questions and partly philosophical ones. Scientifically, we can measure admixture percentages, identify which genes came from archaic humans, determine whether those genes were beneficial or neutral. Philosophically, deciding what it means to be human, whether small amounts of archaic ancestry fundamentally change that identity. Those questions don't have purely empirical answers. They require value judgments about what matters in defining our species. Wolpoff himself has argued that the distinction between species is arbitrary when applied to humans. All these populations, modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, African archaic humans, they could all interbreed. They all contributed to modern human ancestry. Drawing lines between them as separate species is taxonomically convenient, but biologically misleading. They were all part of a single diverse human lineage spread across the old world, evolving in different directions in different regions but maintaining enough contact to remain interfertile. This is actually closer to how most widespread mammal species work. Look at wolves. They're distributed across North America, Europe, and Asia. Different populations have adapted to different environments and look somewhat different, but they're all the same species, Canis lupus, because they can still interbreed. Apply that logic to humans and you get something like the multi-regional model. A widespread species distributed across Africa, Europe, and Asia, with regional populations adapting to local conditions and looking somewhat different, but all remaining part of the same interbreeding lineage. The difference with humans is that we're trying to reconstruct this from fossils and ancient DNA, rather than studying living populations. And fossils don't preserve behaviour or interfertility. They preserve morphology. And the morphological differences between modern humans and Neanderthals are substantial enough that classifying them as separate species seemed reasonable. But now that we know they could interbreed, that classification becomes questionable. Some researchers have proposed a compromise. Keep the species names for practical purposes. They help us organise fossils and discuss evolution, but acknowledge that they represent points on a continuum rather than discrete categories. Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo denisova were all part of a larger human metapopulation, a network of related groups with varying degrees of divergence. Sometimes divergence was great enough that we treat them as separate species, sometimes it wasn't. But all were part of the broader human evolutionary story. This framework helps explain why archaic admixture looks the way it does. If modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, were part of the same metapopulation, all descending from earlier African populations that had spread across the Old World, then interbreeding between them wouldn't be rare or difficult. It would be natural. Expected. The default outcome when populations that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years came back into contact. The amount of admixture, 1 to 4% for Neanderthals, 4 to 6% for Denisovans in certain populations, 6 to 7% from African ghost populations, suggests that interbreeding happened but wasn't the dominant process. Most modern human ancestry comes from populations that hadn't mixed extensively with archaic groups. But enough mixing occurred to leave lasting genetic signatures. This pattern fits with a scenario where modern humans expanding from Africa were more numerous than the archaic populations they encountered. The demographic advantage meant that modern human genes dominated in the hybrid populations. But the archaic populations weren't completely absorbed or driven to extinction immediately. There was a period of coexistence, probably thousands of years in some regions, during which interbreeding occurred. Eventually, the archaic populations disappeared as distinct entities. Their genes diluted into the larger modern human population. This is assimilation, not replacement. The difference matters because it changes how we think about our relationship to archaic humans. If they were completely replaced, they're not really our ancestors. They're evolutionary dead ends, experiments that failed. But if they were assimilated, they are our ancestors. Their genes flow in our veins. Their evolutionary history is part of our history. Understanding them is understanding ourselves. It also changes how we think about human diversity. The physical differences between modern human populations, the variation in skin colour, facial features, body proportions, some of this comes from recent adaptation to different environments, but some might come from differential admixture with archaic populations. Neanderthal genes affect skin and hair in modern Europeans. Denisovan genes affect altitude adaptation in Tibetans. African ghost population genes might affect traits in African populations. Human diversity isn't just the result of modern humans adapting to different places. It's also the result of interbreeding with different archaic populations who'd already adapted to those places. This perspective makes the multi-regional comeback more than just an academic debate about models. It's about recognizing the full complexity of human evolution. Africa was central. But Asia and Europe weren't just passive recipients of African migrants. They hosted their own human populations with their own evolutionary histories. And when African and Eurasian populations met, they didn't simply displace one another. They merged. They created hybrid populations that combined African innovations with Eurasian adaptations. The multi-regional model, in its modified form, captures this complexity in a way that pure, out-of-Africa doesn't. It acknowledges multiple centres of human evolution, not independent but interconnected. It recognises that different populations contributed unevenly, but all contributed something to modern humanity. It treats human evolution as a network rather than a tree, with lineages splitting and merging rather than just diverging. Wolpoff and his colleagues were right about the fundamental insight even if they were wrong about the details. Human evolution wasn't simple replacement, it was complex assimilation, and that makes our story richer, more interesting, more true to the messiness of how evolution actually works. Not clean branching divergence but tangled reticulation. Not isolation but connection. Not purity but mixture. That's human evolution. And that's what the multi-regional perspective, updated and modified and integrated with genetic data, helps us understand. Now, we need to go deeper, further back in time than we've been so far. Because the story of human origins doesn't start with anatomically modern humans 200,000 years ago. It doesn't even start with the split between modern humans and Neanderthals 400,000 years ago. The roots of human diversity stretch back over 1 million years, maybe 2 million, into a period so ancient that we're only now beginning to understand what happened. And what happened is stranger than anyone expected. In 2020, a team led by Alan Rogers from the University of Utah published a paper that sent ripples through the anthropology community. They'd been analysing patterns of genetic mutations shared between modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Using statistical methods, they could infer ancient population splits and mixing events from these shared mutation patterns. What they found was evidence of interbreeding between human populations that happened 700,000 years ago. 700,000 years ago, that's not a typo. The interbreeding event occurred between two groups Rogers' team called Super-Archaics and the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans. The Super-Archaics were a human population that had split from all other humans about 2 million years ago, when early Homo erectus or their predecessors first left Africa. They'd evolved separately for over 1 million years. Then, 700,000 years ago, somewhere in Eurasia, they encountered the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans who'd more recently left Africa, and they interbred. This is the earliest known interbreeding event between human populations, and the populations involved were more distantly related than any other human populations known to have interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals, who interbred around 50,000 years ago, had been separated for about 400 to 500,000 years. That already seemed like a long time for maintaining interfertility. But the Super-Archaics and Neanderthal Denisovan ancestors had been separated for well over 1 million years, yet they could still produce viable offspring. This tells us something profound about human evolution. The lineage that would become modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans maintained interfertility with other human lineages for extraordinarily long periods, much longer than typical for mammals. Most mammal species lose the ability to interbreed after a few 100,000 years of separation, but human lineages separated for over 1 million years could still mix genes. This suggests either slower evolution of reproductive barriers in humans or active gene flow between populations that prevented those barriers from forming. Who were the Super-Archaics? We don't know. We don't have fossils that definitively belong to this population. Rogers' team proposed they might have been related to Homo erectus, the long-lived species that inhabited Eurasia for over 1 million years before going extinct. Or they might have been related to Homo heidelbergensis, a species thought to be ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern humans. Or they might have been something else entirely, a lineage we haven't identified yet from the sparse fossil record of this period. What we know is they existed. They were human enough to interbreed with the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans. They were different enough that genetic analysis can detect their contribution as distinct from other human lineages. And their genes persist in modern humans, passed down through Neanderthal and Denisovan intermediaries. Every person of non-African descent carries genetic material not just from Neanderthals and Denisovans, but from these ancient super-archaic humans who split off over 2 million years ago. The discovery of super-archaic admixture pushed back the timeline of human interbreeding dramatically. It wasn't just something that happened recently, in the last 100,000 years. It was a pattern that extended deep into the Pleistocene, back to periods when human evolution was still in its early stages. This suggests that interbreeding between separated human populations was a recurring feature of human evolution, not an unusual recent event, and the Super-Archaics might not be alone. Other genetic studies have found hints of additional ghost populations. In 2019, a different team analysing Denisovan genomes found evidence that Denisovans themselves had interbred with another unknown archaic population. This population had split from other humans even earlier than the Super-Archaics, perhaps as far back as 2 million years or more. The introgression happened about 350,000 years ago, when this extremely ancient lineage encountered Denisovans in Asia and mixed genes. Again, we don't have fossils of this population. We can only detect them through their genetic legacy and Denisovan genomes, but their existence implies an even more complex picture of human evolution in Asia. Multiple ancient human lineages, some descended from very early migrations out of Africa, others from later migrations, all coexisting in overlapping territories, all occasionally interbreeding despite being separated for hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. The term ghost population is apt. These are humans we know existed but can't see directly. They haunt the genetic data, leaving shadows and traces but no physical remains. This might be because their fossils haven't been found yet. More likely it's because they lived in regions or times where fossilization was unlikely, or their fossils exist but haven't been recognized as belonging to a distinct population. The fossil record is too incomplete to capture all the human diversity that existed during the Pleistocene. Genetics reveals populations that paleontology missed. Africa has its own ghost populations. We've mentioned the unknown archaic population that contributed 6 to 7% of ancestry to some West African groups, but there are others. A 2023 study found evidence of multiple deeply divergent lineages in African genomes, lineages that split from other humans between 300,000 and 1 million years ago. These lineages are most common in Central African populations, particularly groups that have historically lived in forest environments, where fossilization is rare. Some researchers think these ghost populations might be related to known African fossils that are hard to classify. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa and dated to between 235,000 and 300,000 years ago, has a bizarre mix of primitive and derived features. Its brain was small, about the size of an orange, yet evidence suggests it used fire and created symbolic engravings. It's unclear how Homo naledi relates to modern humans or whether they could have interbred, but their existence during a period when modern humans were evolving in Africa raises the possibility that they were among the ghost populations that left genetic traces. Other candidates include Homo heidelbergensis populations in Africa. This species, or group of species depending on how you classify them, lived across Africa, Europe and Western Asia between 600,000 and 200,000 years ago. They're thought to be ancestral to both Neanderthals in Europe and modern humans in Africa. But the transition from heidelbergensis to modern humans in Africa isn't well documented. There are few fossils from the crucial period between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago. During this gap, multiple heidelbergensis populations in different parts of Africa might have evolved in different directions, with some becoming more modern, others remaining archaic, but all interbreeding occasionally. The deep time perspective changes how we think about human origins. Instead of modern humans suddenly appearing 200,000 years ago as a distinct new species, we see a gradual transformation over hundreds of thousands of years. Multiple populations across Africa and Eurasia, all descended from earlier hominins, all evolving in different directions but maintaining enough genetic contact to share beneficial mutations and prevent complete speciation. The boundaries between archaic and modern, between different human species, these were fuzzy and permeable throughout the Pleistocene. This helps explain some puzzling features of the fossil record. Why early Homo sapiens fossils like Jebel Irhoud show a mix of modern and archaic traits. Why different fossils from different regions show modern features in different proportions. Why the transition to full anatomical modernity seems to happen gradually and unevenly across Africa. These patterns make sense if we think of human evolution as a network of populations exchanging genes rather than a single lineage evolving in isolation. The genetic data also reveals complexity in how these ancient admixture events affected modern humans. Some archaic genes that entered the modern human genome long ago have been beneficial and increased in frequency through natural selection. Others were harmful and have been eliminated. Most have been neutral, drifting randomly through populations. But all of them have contributed to the genetic diversity we see today. The human genome is a palimpsest, layers of ancestry written over each other, with the oldest layers still faintly visible beneath the most recent. This deep ancestry has practical implications. When researchers study genetic causes of disease, they often find that genetic variants associated with disease risk have complex evolutionary histories. Some disease-associated variants come from Neanderthals. Others come from ancient African populations. Understanding where these variants came from which ancient populations they originated in, helps researchers understand why they persist and what biological functions they might have served in ancestral environments. For example, variants that increase inflammation might have been beneficial in environments with high pathogen loads, helping fight off infections. But in modern environments with different disease profiles, these same variants might contribute to autoimmune diseases. The genetic legacy of ancient populations isn't just academic history, it affects health and disease in living people. The super-archaic perspective also raises questions about how far back we should trace human ancestry. If humans separated by 2 million years could still interbreed, what does that say about the definition of our species? Should we consider all these populations, Super-Archaics, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans as part of a single extended lineage? Or were they genuinely different species that just happened to retain interfertility longer than expected? There's no clear answer. Species definitions work well for living organisms that we can observe directly, but applying them to fossils requires making assumptions about reproductive compatibility that we can't directly test. The genetic data tells us that interbreeding happened, but it doesn't tell us how easy or common it was, whether hybrids were fully fertile or somewhat compromised, whether cultural barriers prevented mixing even when biological barriers didn't. What we can say is that human evolution over the last 2 million years involved a complex web of populations that occasionally interbred. The deepest splits, like the Super-Archaics separating 2 million years ago, represent the outer limits of this web. These populations were about as different from each other as human populations could get, while still being recognizably human, and still capable of producing viable offspring. Yet even they contributed genetic material that persists in modern humans today. This deep time perspective makes human origins simultaneously more mysterious and more comprehensible. More mysterious because it reveals just how much we don't know about Pleistocene human populations. Every genetic study finds new ghost populations, new admixture events, new complexity that wasn't suspected before. The more we learn, the more we realize how much human diversity existed that left no clear fossil record. But it's also more comprehensible because it reveals underlying patterns. Interbreeding between human populations wasn't rare or unusual. It was a recurring feature across hundreds of thousands of years. Different human lineages maintained genetic contact even after long periods of separation. Gene flow between populations was ongoing, not episodic. This connectivity shaped human evolution in fundamental ways, spreading beneficial mutations, preventing complete speciation, creating the diverse but interfertile human populations that existed across the Old World during the Pleistocene. The Super-Archaics and other ghost populations remind us that human evolution extends much further back than the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Our ancestry includes millions of years of earlier human evolution, populations that don't fit neatly into modern species categories, but were nonetheless part of our lineage. We carry genetic echoes of these ancient populations. Their adaptations, their evolutionary experiments, their survival strategies are encoded in our genomes. We are, in a very real sense, the product of millions of years of human diversity encountering, mixing, and evolving together across the Old World. That's our deep time heritage, and it's far richer and more complex than the simple out-of-Africa story ever suggested. So here's the uncomfortable question. If human origins are this complex, this messy, this full of interbreeding and ghost populations and multiple migrations, how did we get locked into the simple out-of-Africa story for so long? How did a model that now looks incomplete, if not wrong in important ways, achieve such dominance that questioning it seemed almost heretical? The answer reveals a lot about how science works, how narratives solidify, and why paradigm shifts are so difficult even when evidence accumulates. Part of the answer is the fossil record itself, or rather, what the fossil record isn't. Fossils are rare, extraordinarily rare. For every organism that ever lived, the odds of becoming a fossil are infinitesimally small. You need to die in the right place, get buried quickly before scavengers scatter your bones, have the right chemical conditions for mineralization, avoid geological destruction for millions of years, and then get exposed by erosion at just the right time for a paleontologist to find you before weather destroys you. Each step in this process has a failure rate approaching 99%. Multiply those probabilities and you get numbers so small they're almost meaningless. This means the fossil record is not a representative sample of past life. It's a heavily biased sample favouring organisms that lived in environments where fossilization is likely. River valleys, lake beds, coastal areas, organisms that lived in mountains, forests or grasslands far from water are vastly underrepresented. Organisms with habits that led to rapid burial, like living near water or dying in floods, are overrepresented. And organisms that were common are more likely to leave fossils than rare ones simply because more individuals mean more chances for fossilization. For human evolution, this creates massive blind spots. Most early human populations probably lived in environments that don't preserve fossils well. Upland forests, open grasslands, coastal zones now submerged by rising sea levels. The fossils we do find come disproportionately from specific regions, East Africa's Rift Valley being the most famous, where geological conditions happen to favour preservation. This makes East Africa look more important to human evolution than it might actually have been. We find lots of fossils there, so we assume that's where important things happened. But maybe we just find lots of fossils there because it's one of the few places where fossils survive. The same bias affects our understanding of population size and distribution. Small populations leave fewer fossils. Populations restricted to poor fossilization, environments leave almost no fossils. If early Homo sapiens consisted of multiple populations spread across Africa, with some in fossil-rich environments and others in fossil-poor ones, we'd only find the ones in favourable locations. This would make it look like humans originated in those specific fossil-rich regions, when actually they were just the only places where preservation was good enough to leave a record. Dating uncertainty makes things worse. Accurately dating fossils older than about 50,000 years is difficult. Radiocarbon dating doesn't work beyond that limit. Other methods: uranium series dating, thermoluminescence, electron spin resonance. They work on older materials but with large error bars. A fossil dated to 200,000 years might actually be anywhere from 150,000 to 250,000 years old. When you're trying to establish which fossils are oldest and therefore closest to human origins, those error bars matter enormously. The oldest fossil might not actually be oldest. It might just have the oldest date within its error range. This dating uncertainty plagued early studies of human origins. Fossils from different regions had dates that overlapped within error bars, making it impossible to say definitively which came first. Researchers had to make judgments based on morphology, comparing which fossils looked more archaic versus more modern. But morphology is subjective. One researcher's archaic feature is another's individual variation. Evolutionary change isn't uniform. Different features evolve at different rates. A fossil might be modern in skull shape but archaic in tooth size or vice versa. Judging evolutionary progression from morphology alone is fraught with ambiguity. Then there's the genetic data, which initially seemed so clear. Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes both pointed to recent African ancestry. The coalescence dates, around 150,000 to 200,000 years for mitochondrial DNA, perfectly matched the oldest Homo sapiens fossils from Africa. Everything lined up. Africa was the origin. Case closed. Except, as we've discussed, mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes represent tiny fractions of ancestry. They're useful markers, but not complete pictures. Early genetic studies didn't have the technology to sequence whole genomes or analyze nuclear DNA comprehensively. They worked with what was available and drew conclusions that seemed justified by that limited data. But those conclusions became entrenched before better data could complicate them. There's also a psychological factor. Scientists, like everyone else, prefer simple explanations. Occam's razor, the principle that simpler explanations are more likely to be true, is deeply ingrained in scientific thinking. Out of Africa is simple. One origin, one migration, clean replacement. It's easy to teach, easy to remember, easy to model mathematically. Multi-regional evolution, even in its weak form, is complicated. Multiple populations, varying amounts of gene flow, complex patterns of admixture. It doesn't reduce to a single narrative that fits in a textbook paragraph. Simplicity has practical advantages in science. Simple models make clear predictions that can be tested. They're easier to falsify, which according to Popperian philosophy of science makes them better science. If a simple model explains the data, you don't need a complicated one. This is all reasonable, but it can create resistance to complicating a model even when new data demands it. Researchers invested in the simple model naturally try to fit new data into that framework, rather than abandoning it for something messier. This happened with Neanderthal admixture. When the first evidence appeared, some out of Africa proponents argued it was noise or contamination. When it became undeniable, they argued it was trivial. 1 to 2% doesn't really matter. When functional effects of Neanderthal DNA were discovered, they argued this was consistent with out of Africa, just with limited hybridization. Each new finding was incorporated into the existing model, rather than prompting a rethinking of the model itself. This is normal scientific conservatism, but it can delay paradigm shifts. There's also a social dimension to scientific consensus. Once a model becomes dominant, it becomes the default assumption. Graduate students are trained in that model. Papers are written assuming that framework. Textbooks teach it as established fact. Questioning the consensus becomes professionally risky. You might be right, but you're challenging the field's foundational assumptions, which tends to make senior researchers defensive. Your papers might get rejected by reviewers who don't share your perspective. Your grant applications might fail because review panels think you're pursuing dead ends. This doesn't mean science is fundamentally broken. It means science is a human enterprise, conducted by humans with human biases and human social structures. Consensus forms around ideas that seem well supported, and that consensus creates inertia. Overcoming that inertia requires overwhelming evidence, and usually a generational change as older researchers retire and younger ones more open to new ideas replace them. The out of Africa consensus also had a moral dimension that made questioning it uncomfortable. As we discussed in the first chapter, the model provided a scientifically rigorous argument for human unity. All humans are recent Africans, all part of one species, all closely related. This undercut racist claims about fundamental biological differences between populations. In the context of 20th century history, with its legacy of scientific racism, slavery, colonialism, and genocide, the out of Africa model was morally attractive. It said we're all family. We all share a common recent heritage. Questioning out of Africa risked seeming to support racist ideas about separate origins or deep divisions between populations. Multiregionalism, even though it didn't actually argue for racial hierarchy, was sometimes associated with those ideas in popular understanding. This made researchers cautious about anything that seemed to undermine out of Africa's message of unity. The science became entangled with politics and morality in ways that made objective evaluation harder. But here's the thing: the new data, the discovery of archaic admixture, the evidence for Pan-African origins, the ghost populations and complex gene flow, none of this actually supports racism or undermines human unity. If anything, it makes the case for unity stronger. We're all hybrids, all carrying ancestry from multiple sources, all the product of populations mixing and merging throughout our evolutionary history. The differences between modern populations are even more recent and superficial than out of Africa suggested, because some of our diversity comes from differential admixture with archaic populations that had already adapted to different regions. Understanding this required the field to accept that rejecting simple, out of Africa doesn't mean embracing the alternative they feared. It means embracing a more complex truth that's still fundamentally about connection and shared ancestry, just in more nuanced ways than the original model allowed. Finally, there's the problem of momentum. Science has institutional inertia. Once resources flow towards certain questions, certain methods, certain interpretive frameworks, redirecting those resources is difficult. For decades, human origins research was organized around testing and refining out of Africa. Field projects went to East Africa looking for older Homo sapiens fossils. Lab projects focused on mitochondrial DNA to trace maternal lineages. Theoretical work modeled single origin scenarios. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Research designed to test out of Africa kept finding support for out of Africa, because that's what the research was designed to detect. Complications like archaic admixture only became visible when new technologies, whole genome sequencing of ancient DNA, allowed questions that couldn't be asked before. These technologies weren't developed to challenge out of Africa. They were developed for other reasons and happened to generate data that didn't fit the model. Once that data existed, it couldn't be ignored. But for years, the questions that might have revealed complexity weren't being asked because everyone assumed the model was basically correct. This is a general pattern in science. Paradigms shift not because evidence proves the old model wrong in some absolute sense, but because new methods and new questions reveal patterns the old paradigm can't explain. Thomas Kuhn described this in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Normal science proceeds by elaborating and refining existing paradigms. Revolutionary science happens when accumulated anomalies become too large to ignore, and a new paradigm emerges that explains both the old data and the anomalies. Human origins are currently in that transitional state. The out-of-Africa paradigm hasn't been overthrown, but it's being fundamentally modified to accommodate archaic admixture, Pan-African origins, multiple migrations, and complex gene flow. The new paradigm isn't fully formed yet. Researchers are still working out what it means, what new predictions it makes, how to teach it. But the transition is underway, driven by data that the old model can't adequately explain. So why did we get it wrong? We didn't, exactly. We got it partially right with the data available. Africa is central to human origins. Recent African ancestry is real. These insights from the out-of-Africa era remain valid. What we got wrong was thinking we had the complete picture when we only had fragments. What we got wrong was preferring simplicity over accuracy. What we got wrong was letting a scientifically useful model harden into an unchallengeable paradigm. The lesson isn't that scientists were foolish or biased, though bias played a role. The lesson is that science is always provisional. What we know today is the best explanation we have for the evidence we've gathered so far. Tomorrow's evidence might complicate or contradict today's model. That's not a failure of science. That's how science works. Progress comes from being willing to revise our understanding when new data demands it, even when that revision makes the story messier and less satisfying than what we'd believed before. So where does that leave us? After everything we've explored, after all the complications and qualifications and evidence that doesn't fit the simple story, what can we actually say about human origins? Where did we come from? The honest answer is we're not entirely sure, and that's okay. That's actually progress. Because being uncertain in sophisticated ways, understanding the limits of our knowledge, recognizing the complexity we can't yet fully explain, that's better than being confidently wrong. Here's what we know with reasonable confidence. Anatomically, modern humans, people who looked essentially like us, emerged in Africa sometime between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. Not in one place, not from one population, but from multiple populations distributed across the continent. Populations that stayed in genetic contact but evolved separately enough to maintain distinct characteristics for hundreds of thousands of years. These populations exchanged genes, shared beneficial mutations, and gradually converged on what we now recognize as modern human anatomy. This process wasn't instantaneous. Different modern features appeared at different times in different populations. The fossil record shows this clearly. Some early fossils have modern faces but archaic skulls. Others have modern skulls but archaic teeth. Eventually, through gene flow between populations, the full package of modern features came together. But there was no single moment when humans suddenly appeared, just a gradual emergence across Africa over tens of thousands of years. During this period, these emerging modern humans were encountering and interbreeding with archaic human populations in Africa. Populations descended from earlier hominins, populations that retained more primitive features, populations we can detect genetically, but haven't definitively identified in the fossil record. These ghost populations contributed significantly to modern African ancestry. Some West African populations carry 6 to 7% archaic ancestry from within Africa. This isn't trivial mixing. This is substantial gene flow that shaped modern human evolution before any populations left Africa. At some point, probably multiple points, modern or near-modern human populations began moving out of Africa into the Middle East and beyond. The evidence suggests this happened earlier and more often than the simple out-of-Africa model proposed. We have modern humans in Israel 177,000 years ago, stone tools suggesting human presence in Arabia 125,000 years ago, possible modern humans in China over 100,000 years ago. These early migrations might have failed, populations dying out or being absorbed back into African gene pools, or they might have established persistent populations that contributed to later humans in ways we haven't yet detected. The major expansion that led to all modern non-African populations happened more recently, probably between 70 and 50,000 years ago. A population, maybe several populations, left Africa and spread rapidly across Eurasia. These people carried with them African genetic diversity, African innovations in stone tool technology, African cultural practices. They were successful in ways earlier migrants might not have been. Within 20,000 years they'd reached Australia. Within 30,000 years they'd populated Europe. Within 50,000 years they'd reached the Americas. No other mammal species has ever expanded so fast across such diverse environments. But this expansion wasn't simple replacement. As these modern humans moved across Eurasia, they encountered other human populations, Neanderthals in the west, Denisovans in the east, possibly other archaic groups we haven't identified yet, and instead of driving these populations to extinction through competition alone, the modern humans interbred with them. The genetic evidence for this is unambiguous. Non-African populations today carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Melanesian and Australian populations carry 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA. These aren't trivial contributions. This is substantial admixture that left lasting impacts on modern human biology. Some of the genes inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans were beneficial. They helped modern humans adapt to new environments, fight off new diseases, survive in climates their African ancestors had never encountered. Natural selection favoured these archaic genes, increasing their frequency in populations where they were useful. Today, those genes affect immune function, skin pigmentation, altitude adaptation, and countless other traits. We are quite literally hybrid creatures created from the merger of multiple ancient human lineages. The Neanderthals and Denisovans eventually disappeared as distinct populations. By about 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone from Europe. Denisovans might have persisted longer in Asia, but they too eventually vanished. We don't know exactly why. Climate change, competition with modern humans, disease, assimilation into the larger modern human population, probably all of these factors played roles, but their disappearance wasn't complete extinction. Their genes survived in us. They still influence human biology today. In that sense, they didn't go extinct. They became us. Going even deeper in time, we now know that interbreeding between human populations wasn't unique to the modern human expansion. It happened earlier, much earlier. Super-archaic populations that split from other humans 2 million years ago still managed to interbreed with the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans 700,000 years ago. Even more ancient populations, splitting perhaps even earlier, contributed genes to Denisovans 350,000 years ago. Human evolution involved recurrent mixing between separated populations across hundreds of thousands of years. This pattern suggests something fundamental about human evolution. We're not a single lineage gradually transforming over time. We're a braided stream, multiple lineages flowing separately and together, splitting and merging, creating a complex genetic legacy that includes contributions from populations separated by geography and time but never completely isolated. Gene flow between populations, even populations separated by vast distances and hundreds of thousands of years, was common enough to leave lasting marks in modern genomes. What does this mean for the question of whether humans originated in Africa? It means the question itself might be poorly framed. If by humans we mean anatomically modern Homo sapiens, then yes, that anatomical package emerged in Africa from African populations. But those populations were already carrying genetic ancestry from earlier hominins, some of which might have evolved partly outside Africa before their descendants returned. And those modern humans, when they left Africa, immediately began mixing with non-African populations, incorporating their genes, creating hybrid populations that aren't purely African in ancestry. The species we call Homo sapiens is primarily African in origin. But we're not purely Homo sapiens. We're Homo sapiens plus Neanderthals plus Denisovans plus African ghost populations, plus possibly other archaic humans we haven't identified yet. Our genome is a mosaic of ancestry from multiple sources, accumulated over millions of years, shaped by evolution acting in multiple populations across multiple continents. So the answer to where humans came from isn't a place, it's a process. A process that began in Africa with the emergence of modern anatomy from diverse African populations. A process that continued as some populations migrated out of Africa and encountered archaic humans in Eurasia. A process that included multiple episodes of interbreeding, gene flow, population mixture creating the genetic diversity we see today. A process that's still ongoing as human populations continue to mix, merge, and evolve. This is messier than the simple out of Africa story. It doesn't give us a single homeland to point to. It doesn't provide a clean timeline with clear beginnings and endings. It requires us to hold multiple ideas in tension. Africa was central but not exclusive. Modern humans evolved there but from diverse populations. The expansion out of Africa was recent but with earlier attempts. Replacement happened but so did assimilation. We're primarily African but partly archaic. These aren't contradictions. They're the reality of a complex evolutionary process that doesn't reduce to simple statements. Does this mean out of Africa is wrong? No. It means it's incomplete. Africa's central role in human evolution is supported by every line of evidence. The genetic diversity, the fossil record, the archaeological evidence of technological innovation, it all points to Africa as the primary source of modern human ancestry. What's changed is our understanding of what that origin process involved. Not one population in one place at one time. Multiple populations across the continent over hundreds of thousands of years. Not complete replacement of non-African populations. Assimilation with substantial gene flow. Not isolated evolution. Continuous mixing and merging of populations whenever they came into contact. The scientific consensus is shifting to accommodate these complexities. Researchers now talk about Pan-African origins rather than single-point origins. They emphasize assimilation over replacement. They acknowledge the contribution of archaic populations to modern human diversity. The textbooks are being rewritten. The documentaries are being updated. The story we tell about human origins is becoming more accurate even as it becomes more complicated. But many questions remain unanswered. We still don't know exactly when modern humans first left Africa. The dates keep getting pushed back as new evidence emerges. We don't know how many separate migrations there were or what happened to the earliest migrants. We don't know the full extent of archaic admixture, or which archaic populations contributed to which modern populations. We haven't identified most of the ghost populations that genetic data reveals. We don't understand why some archaic groups like Neanderthals disappeared, while others like the ancestors of modern humans thrived. New discoveries keep complicating the picture. Every few years, a fossil is found that doesn't fit existing models. Every genome sequenced reveals new patterns of ancestry we hadn't detected before. Every refined dating method changes the timeline in small but significant ways. The story of human origins is far from complete. Large parts remain unknown. Other parts are hotly debated with experts disagreeing about interpretations of the same evidence. And that's okay. That's how science is supposed to work. Uncertainty isn't failure. It's honesty about the limits of our knowledge. The question isn't whether we have all the answers. It's whether we're asking the right questions, using the best methods, following the evidence wherever it leads even when it contradicts what we thought we knew. Human origins will probably always remain somewhat mysterious. The evidence is fragmentary. Time has erased most of what happened. We're reconstructing millions of years of history from incomplete fossils, degraded DNA, scattered stone tools, and statistical inferences about ancient populations. It's remarkable we can reconstruct as much as we have, but we should never mistake our current best understanding for complete knowledge. What we can say with confidence is that human evolution was a complex, drawn-out, continent-spanning process involving multiple populations, multiple migrations, and extensive gene flow between groups. We're the product of millions of years of human diversity, not the descendants of a single founding population. Our ancestry is braided, not linear. Our origins are plural, not singular. And our story is still being written as new evidence emerges and our understanding continues to evolve. If you're listening to this as you drift off to sleep, maybe that's the right note to end on. The mystery of human origins. The knowledge that we came from something complex and ancient and diverse. The recognition that we're all carrying genetic legacies from multiple human populations that lived across Africa, Europe, and Asia over hundreds of thousands of years. We're all hybrids, all products of mixing and merging, all proof that human evolution was never about purity or isolation, but about connection, adaptation, and the creation of something new from the combination of the old. So did humans originate in Africa? Mostly yes. But with enough complications, qualifications, and exceptions that the simple answer doesn't capture the full truth. The truth is messier, more interesting, more human really. Because humans have always been complicated. We've always been diverse. We've always mixed when we met. And that pattern, stretching back millions of years, is what made us who we are today. Sleep well, knowing that wherever you are, whatever your ancestry, you carry within you the genetic legacy of populations that lived across the old world for hundreds of thousands of years. African populations that evolved modern anatomy. Neanderthals who survived Ice Age Europe. Denisovans who adapted to Asia. Ghost populations we can barely detect. Super-Archaics who split off millions of years ago. All of them contributed. All of them matter. All of them are part of your heritage, your history, your story. Human origins weren't simple. They were beautifully, frustratingly, wonderfully complex, and we're still figuring them out.